Grace had always known that love could be measured in the weight of silence. Her hands never shook until that October evening when Charles Harrington threw those leather shoes at her feet. "Put them on if you dare," he had snarled, his eyes cold as the marble floors she polished every morning. But Grace had done something unexpected. She caught those shoes mid-air, held them against her chest like a shield, and whispered words that would haunt him for months. "I have walked many paths in these shoes, Mr. Harrington, more than you'll ever see. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're watching over a child who isn't yours, setting a table for someone who never says thank you, or just hoping to be seen. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart." The morning Grace first stepped into the Harrington mansion, she carried a universe of quiet hope in her worn leather purse. It was February 2019. And snow dusted the towering windows of the Upper East Side penthouse like powdered sugar on a cake too expensive to taste. Her breath formed small clouds in the marble foyer while she waited, hands folded, studying the oil paintings that seemed to judge her from their gilded frames. Each piece probably cost more than her mother's Brooklyn apartment rent for an entire year, but Grace wasn't intimidated. She had learned long ago that wealth could fill rooms but not hearts. Charles Harrington descended the spiral staircase like a king surveying his kingdom. At 42, he possessed the kind of sharp handsomeness that came from privilege and power. Steel gray eyes, silver threading through his dark hair, a jawline carved from determination and countless business victories. His net worth had climbed past $50 million through strategic investments in cryptocurrency and Manhattan real estate. But his children's laughter had become as rare as his genuine smiles. "You're the nanny," he said, not a question, but a statement wrapped in dismissal. His handshake was firm but brief, as if prolonged contact might contaminate his perfectly pressed shirt sleeve. "Emily is 9, Jacob is 7. They need structure, discipline, and boundaries, nothing more." Grace nodded, though something in her chest tightened at his coldness. "And love, Mr. Harrington. Children always need love." He paused on the marble step, turning back with eyes that held winter. "Love is a luxury we can't afford to confuse with employment. You're here to care for them, not replace their mother." The mention of the children's mother hung in the air like expensive perfume, present but untouchable. Grace had read about Margaret Harrington's tragic death in a car accident 3 years prior, how the newspapers called it a devastating loss for New York society. But standing in this museum of a home, Grace could feel the deeper truth. This family hadn't just lost a wife and mother, they had lost their ability to let anyone else fill that sacred space. Emily appeared first, a wisp of a girl with her father's gray eyes and hair like spun honey. She peeked around the corner of the grand piano, studying Grace with the careful assessment of someone far older than 9. Her school uniform was perfectly pressed, shoes polished to mirror brightness, but her small hands clutched a stuffed rabbit whose ear had been loved thin from countless midnight tears. "Are you going to leave too?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question struck Grace like a physical blow. How many caregivers had walked through these marble halls, promising temporary love before disappearing into the revolving door of domestic staff? Grace knelt down until she was eye level with the little girl, noting how Emily instinctively stepped back, already armored against disappointment. "I don't make promises lightly, sweetheart," Grace said softly. "But I'm here now, and that's what matters." Jacob burst into the room like sunshine, breaking through storm clouds, all gangly limbs and untied shoelaces, his school backpack dragging behind him like a reluctant pet. At 7, he still possessed that magical ability to find wonder in ordinary moments, though Grace could see the careful way he watched his father's face, searching for approval that rarely came. "Dad, can Grace make pancakes?" Mrs. Henderson always burned them, and Mrs. Rodriguez said pancakes weren't in her job description, and Mrs. "Enough." Charles's voice cut through his son's rambling like a blade. "Grace will follow the meal schedules I've outlined. There's no need for special requests." But Grace was already smiling at Jacob, seeing past his father's rigid rules to the little boy who simply wanted someone to care enough to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. "We'll see what we can manage," she whispered when Charles turned away, and Jacob's face lit up like the 4th of July. That first night, Grace unpacked her few belongings in the staff quarters, a beautiful but sterile suite on the mansion's 3rd floor. The windows overlooked Central Park, a view worth millions, but the room felt like an elegant prison. She could hear the children's voices echoing through the heating vents, Emily reading bedtime stories to her stuffed animals, Jacob practicing his multiplication tables with the determined intensity of someone trying to earn love through achievement. Grace had grown up in Bed-Stuy before gentrification transformed her neighborhood into something she could no longer afford. Her own mother had worked 3 jobs just to keep their small apartment, coming home each night with sore feet and stories about other people's children who called her by her first name instead of Mama. Grace understood the invisible boundaries that money created, how it could make you feel grateful for scraps of acknowledgement while your soul slowly starved. But as she listened to those little voices through the vents, Grace made herself a promise. She would love these children fiercely and completely, even if it broke her heart. Even if Charles Harrington never saw her as anything more than a name on a paycheck, even if she had to guard her emotions like precious coins in a world that demanded she spend them freely, but never expected anything in return. The first week became a delicate dance of learning boundaries while building bridges. Grace discovered that Emily had nightmares about losing everyone she loved, that Jacob collected bottle caps because his mother had once told him they were treasure, and that Charles worked 18-hour days to avoid the deafening silence that filled his penthouse like fog. When Friday arrived, Grace prepared her first weekend absence. Domestic staff traditionally had Sundays off, and Charles had made it clear that his children's care on weekends was manageable without her. But as she gathered her coat, Emily appeared at her elbow like a ghost. "Where do you go when you leave us?" The question carried such weight that Grace sank onto the hallway bench, pulling Emily beside her. Through the massive windows, Manhattan glittered like scattered diamonds, each light representing someone else's life, someone else's family. "I go to my apartment in Brooklyn," Grace said gently. "I read books, call my sister, water my plants, small things that make me feel human." Emily nodded solemnly, as if filing away this information for future reference. "Do you have children?" The question lodged in Grace's throat like a stone. She had carried a child once, 15 years ago, a daughter she had lost at 6 months to complications she couldn't afford to fix. The medical bills had consumed her savings, her apartment, her marriage, everything except the hollow ache that still woke her some nights. "No, sweetheart, but taking care of you and Jacob makes my heart feel very full." Emily leaned against her shoulder, a gesture so trusting and natural that Grace's eyes filled with tears she couldn't let fall. In that moment, she understood that her own broken heart had somehow prepared her to hold these broken pieces of family together, even if she could never officially belong to them. As February melted into March, Grace became the invisible thread weaving through the Harrington household. She learned that Charles took his coffee black at 6:15 sharp, that Emily loved stories about brave princesses who saved themselves, and that Jacob needed exactly 3 bedtime songs to fall asleep peacefully. She discovered the house's rhythms, how morning light slanted through the kitchen windows, how the radiator in the children's bathroom made a gentle humming sound that could soothe nightmares, how Charles's footsteps on marble could predict his mood before he said a word. The mansion itself was a monument to success, but felt hollow as an echo chamber. 15 rooms decorated by professionals who had never lived in them, art chosen for investment value rather than joy, furniture beautiful enough for magazine spreads, but never comfortable enough for actual living. Grace's presence transformed it gradually, subtly. Fresh flowers in mason jars, children's artwork displayed prominently despite Charles's subtle disapproval, the smell of vanilla and cinnamon that began to replace the sterile scent of expensive cleaning products. But with each passing day, Grace also felt the weight of her invisibility growing heavier. When business associates visited for dinner, she served their meals like a ghost, acknowledged with polite nods but never included in conversation. When the children's friends came for playdates, their parents chatted with Charles about schools and investments while Grace folded laundry in the background, her presence so expected it had become unremarkable. The worst moments came during family photographs. Charles would arrange Emily and Jacob for their annual portraits, professional photographers adjusting lights and angles to capture the perfect image of father and children. Grace would watch from the hallway, knowing that her daily presence in their lives would never be documented, never be remembered in any official record of this family's history. "You're not family," Charles reminded her one evening when she lingered too long during dinner conversation. "Please maintain appropriate boundaries." The words stung like salt on an open wound, but Grace simply nodded and retreated to the kitchen. She understood that Charles's cruelty came from his own pain, but understanding didn't make the rejection hurt less. She was allowed to love his children, but forbidden to claim any place in their hearts publicly. She could give everything but could never receive acknowledgement in return. Yet despite the constant reminders of her place, Grace continued pouring herself into Emily and Jacob's lives like water into thirsty soil. She taught Emily to braid friendship bracelets during quiet afternoons, showed Jacob how to tend the small herb garden they had planted together on the mansion's roof terrace. She celebrated every small victory: Emily's first perfect spelling test, Jacob's successful bike ride without training wheels, with the fierce pride of someone who understood that love multiplied when shared rather than diminished. Spring arrived with a fury of cherry blossoms and renewal, and with it came the first crack in Charles's carefully constructed emotional armor. It happened on a Tuesday morning in April when Jacob woke up burning with fever, his small body shaking with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. Grace found him crying softly in his bed, calling for his mother in the confused way that sick children do, reaching for comfort from someone who could never answer. Charles was already at his downtown office, deep in negotiations for a cryptocurrency investment that could potentially add another $10 million to his portfolio. His assistant took Grace's frantic call, promising to relay the message that Jacob needed medical attention, but hours passed without response. The fever climbed, and Jacob began hallucinating, seeing his mother in the shadows, begging her not to leave him again. Grace didn't hesitate. She bundled Jacob in warm blankets and took him to Mount Sinai's emergency room herself, sitting in those plastic chairs for 6 hours while doctors ran tests and administered IV fluids. She held his small hand while nurses drew blood, sang his favorite lullabies while they waited for results, and promised him over and over that he was safe, that she wouldn't leave him alone. When Charles finally arrived at the hospital, his face was a mask of controlled panic, wrapped in expensive wool. He found Grace asleep in the chair beside Jacob's bed, her hand still intertwined with his son's fingers, her hair falling loose from its careful bun after hours of worry. For just a moment, before his defenses snapped back into place, Charles saw her clearly, not as an employee, but as someone who loved his child enough to sacrifice her own comfort without a second thought. "The pneumonia is responding to antibiotics," the doctor explained quietly. "Another few hours delay, and this could have been much more serious. Your nanny's quick thinking potentially saved your son's life." Charles nodded stiffly, but Grace caught the way his jaw tightened, how his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She understood that gratitude felt dangerous to him, that acknowledging her importance might crack open grief he had spent 3 years trying to seal shut. "Thank you," he said finally, the words forced out like splinters. "You can take tomorrow off. I'll arrange for private nurses." Grace simply nodded, gathering her purse and coat with quiet dignity. As she reached the hospital room door, Jacob stirred awake, his fever-bright eyes seeking her face. "Grace? You're not leaving forever, are you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and for just a heartbeat, Charles met her eyes across his son's bed. In that instant, Grace saw something crack behind his carefully constructed walls, the first glimpse of a man who understood that his children needed more than money and structure could provide. "I'll be there tomorrow morning to make you breakfast," Grace promised softly. "Pancakes shaped like dragons, just like we talked about." Jacob smiled and closed his eyes, secure in the knowledge that some promises could be trusted. But as Grace walked through the hospital's sliding doors into the cool April night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the surface of their carefully ordered world. Charles stood at his son's bedside long after Grace left, watching Jacob sleep peacefully for the first time in days. The boy's breathing was easier now, no longer labored, but Charles found his own chest tight with emotions he had spent years suppressing. Grace had sat in that chair for 6 hours without complaint, had held his son's hand while he closed million-dollar deals, had whispered comfort while he negotiated cryptocurrency futures. She had been the mother his children needed while he remained frozen in his grief, unable to offer anything beyond financial security. The realization should have brought him gratitude, but instead, it kindled something darker, a resentment born from his own inadequacy. Grace made loving look effortless when Charles had forgotten how to do it at all. She filled the spaces in his children's hearts that he couldn't access, becoming indispensable in ways that terrified him. Over the following weeks, Charles found himself watching Grace more carefully, noting how she moved through his household like gentle water, smoothing rough edges and nurturing growth wherever she went. Emily had stopped having nightmares, and Jacob hummed while doing homework. Small miracles that had nothing to do with Charles's wealth and everything to do with Grace's patient presence. But rather than softening his defenses, these observations hardened them further. Charles began leaving subtle reminders of Grace's place in the household hierarchy, important mail left where she might see it, business calls taken in rooms where she was working, conversations about Emily and Jacob's futures that pointedly excluded any mention of their caregiver's role in shaping them. "The children are becoming too attached," he mentioned one evening in May, his voice carefully neutral as Grace cleaned up after dinner. "It's important they understand the temporary nature of employment relationships." Grace's hands stilled on the dishes she was washing, soap bubbles clinging to her fingers like tiny prisons. "Love isn't temporary, Mr. Harrington. Even when people leave, the love remains." "Exactly my point," Charles replied coolly. "We can't afford for them to confuse professional care with familial bonds. It wouldn't be fair to anyone involved." The conversation ended there, but Grace felt its implications settling over her like a cold shadow. Charles was reminding her, as he did regularly, that her place in his children's hearts came with an expiration date, that no matter how deeply she loved Emily and Jacob, she could be dismissed at any moment, her history with them reduced to a reference letter and a final paycheck. That night, Grace lay awake in her beautiful but lonely room, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Through the heating vents, she could hear Emily reading bedtime stories to her stuffed animals, Jacob practicing his spelling words with determined whispers. These children had become the center of her world, but she remained peripheral to theirs in any official capacity. June brought longer days and plans for the children's summer activities, exclusive camps and private tutoring that would consume most of their vacation time. Charles scheduled these activities efficiently, like a CEO organizing quarterly reports, but Grace noticed he never asked what Emily and Jacob actually wanted to do with their summer freedom. "Could we maybe have 1 week where we just stay home?" Emily asked tentatively during breakfast. "Grace could teach us how to make a garden, and we could read books together, and maybe have picnics in the park." Charles looked up from his financial reports, his expression unreadable. "Your time is better spent in structured educational environments. Grace has other responsibilities during camp hours. The house needs deep cleaning, and there are repairs to oversee." Grace felt her heart sink as Emily's face fell. The little girl had been looking forward to lazy summer days together, to the kind of unscheduled time that allowed relationships to deepen naturally. But Charles had effectively dismissed that possibility, reducing Grace once again to her functional roles while denying the emotional one that mattered most to his daughter. Of course, Grace said quietly, meeting Emily's disappointed eyes with an apologetic smile. But we can still have picnics in the evenings after camp, if that's all right with your father. Charles nodded curtly, already returning to his reading, missing entirely the way Jacob's shoulders sagged with disappointment or how Emily's bright morning energy dimmed like a candle being snuffed out. As summer progressed, Grace felt the distance Charles maintained between her and his children becoming more pronounced. He scheduled family activities during her days off, hired temporary sitters when evening social obligations arose, and made decisions about Emily and Jacob's lives without consulting the woman who spent more waking hours with them than anyone else. The children began to notice, too. Jacob asked why Grace couldn't come to his baseball games, and Emily wondered aloud why Grace never appeared in any of their family photos. Their questions were innocent but pointed, highlighting the artificial boundaries Charles had constructed around their relationships. Because Grace has her own life, Charles would explain patiently. She's not part of our family. She's someone who helps take care of you. These explanations left Emily and Jacob confused and sad, but they began to internalize the message that loving Grace too openly might be inappropriate, that their attachment to her should remain hidden or minimized. Grace watched this emotional withdrawal with growing heartbreak, understanding that Charles was teaching his children to replicate his own emotional distance. The breaking point came on a sweltering July evening when the air conditioning in the mansion failed just as Charles was hosting an important dinner party. Grace worked frantically to keep guests comfortable, serving chilled drinks and arranging fans while sweat dampened her carefully pressed uniform. The children, cranky from the heat and excited by the unusual evening energy, kept wandering into the dining room despite repeated instructions to stay upstairs. "Grace, control them!" Charles snapped during a particularly heated business discussion about blockchain investments. "This isn't a playground." Emily had been trying to show a guest her latest art project, a beautiful watercolor painting of the herb garden she'd created with Grace. But Charles's harsh tone sent her scurrying back upstairs in embarrassment. Jacob, who had simply wanted a glass of water, followed his sister with tears in his eyes. Grace excused herself and found both children huddled in Emily's room, confused and hurt by their father's public rejection. She held them close, whispering reassurances while her own heart broke for their humiliation. "Why doesn't Daddy want us around when other people come?" Emily asked, her voice small and wounded. Grace chose her words carefully, not wanting to criticize Charles, but needing to heal the children's wounded spirits. "Your father loves you very much, sweetheart. Sometimes adults get stressed about work things and they forget how to show love properly." When she returned downstairs an hour later, the dinner party was winding down, guests departing into the cooled evening air with handshakes and promises to follow up on various business opportunities. Charles was loosening his tie, looking exhausted but satisfied with whatever negotiations had taken place. "The children are finally asleep," Grace reported quietly. "I've set up fans in their rooms until the air conditioning can be repaired tomorrow." Charles nodded absently, then glanced at her sweaty, wrinkled uniform with mild distaste. "You look unprofessional. Next time there are guests, please maintain better appearance standards." The criticism was the final straw in a day full of small humiliations and dismissals. Grace felt something snap inside her chest, not anger, exactly, but a profound weariness born from months of loving without acknowledgement, of giving everything while receiving only reminders of her inadequacy. "I kept your guests comfortable," she said quietly. "I kept your children safe and happy upstairs while you conducted business. I worked through a heat emergency without complaint. If that's unprofessional, then perhaps you need to reconsider what you're actually paying me to do." Charles's eyes hardened at her tone, unused to any pushback from his domestic staff. "I'm paying you to follow instructions without argument. If that's beyond your capabilities, there are other nannies in New York." The threat hung between them like a blade, sharp and unmistakable. Grace felt her world tilt slightly. Understanding that all her months of devotion could be erased with a single phone call, that Emily and Jacob could wake up tomorrow to find her gone without explanation or goodbye. "I understand," she whispered, because what else could she say? She was replaceable in Charles's eyes, her love for his children just another service he could purchase elsewhere if she became inconvenient. But as Grace climbed the stairs to her room that night, she made a decision that would change everything. She was tired of being invisible, tired of loving in silence, tired of watching Charles diminish her role in his children's lives while she sacrificed her heart piece by piece. For the first time since arriving at the Harrington mansion, Grace began to consider what it might mean to choose herself, instead of choosing to stay where she wasn't truly valued. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly tense over the following weeks, with Charles seeming to find fault with everything Grace did. He criticized her cooking, questioned her decisions about the children's activities, and made pointed comments about finding more suitable long-term arrangements for Emily and Jacob's care. Grace understood that he was pushing her toward a decision: stay and accept constant undermining of her authority and affection, or leave and break her own heart to preserve what remained of her dignity. It was a cruel choice that many domestic workers faced, but knowing its commonality didn't make it hurt less. The children sensed the growing tension, becoming clingy and anxious in ways they hadn't been since Grace's early days with them. Jacob started having accidents at night, and Emily began hoarding snacks in her room, unconsciously preparing for another loss. They asked Grace repeatedly if she was going to leave, and her reassurances felt increasingly hollow as Charles's hostility mounted. August arrived with a vengeance, bringing humid days that made the mansion feel like a beautiful greenhouse, all glass and trapped heat. Grace had been working for the Harringtons for 6 months, half a year of loving other people's children while feeling increasingly erased from their official family story. The explosion came on an ordinary Thursday evening when nothing extraordinary should have happened at all. Grace was in the children's playroom, helping Emily organize her art supplies, while Jacob built elaborate structures from wooden blocks. The television played softly in the background, some documentary about ocean life that had captured Jacob's fascination. It was a peaceful domestic scene, full of the quiet contentment that Grace had learned to treasure. Charles burst into the room like a thunderstorm made flesh, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed disproportionate to whatever had triggered it. In his hand, he clutched a small ceramic figurine, a painted horse that Emily had made in art class and given to Grace as a gift. "What is this doing in your room?" he demanded, holding up the figurine like evidence in a criminal trial. Grace looked up from the art supplies, confused by his anger. "Emily made it for me. It's a gift." "My children don't give gifts to the staff," Charles snarled. "You're overstepping boundaries, encouraging inappropriate attachments. This behavior stops now." Emily shrank back against the bookshelf, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. Jacob's block tower forgotten, his attention focused entirely on the strange intensity radiating from his father. "It's just a little horse, Daddy," Emily whispered. "I wanted Grace to have something pretty for her room." "Grace's room isn't her home," Charles snapped. "She's an employee, not family. You need to understand the difference." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, poisoning the peaceful atmosphere Grace had worked so hard to create. She watched Emily's face crumple with shame, saw Jacob's lower lip begin to tremble, and felt something fundamental break inside her chest. "The children were just being kind," Grace said quietly, rising to her feet with careful dignity. "There's no harm in—" "Don't tell me what's harmful for my children," Charles interrupted, his voice rising dangerously. "You've been filling their heads with fantasies about belonging, about permanence. It's confusing and it's damaging." Grace felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time something was different. Maybe it was the sight of Emily trying not to cry, or Jacob's frightened confusion, or simply the accumulated weight of 6 months spent loving in silence while being systematically diminished. Whatever the catalyst, Grace felt her usual careful patience evaporate like water on hot stone. "What's confusing?" she said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. is watching you push away everyone who tries to love you and your children. What's damaging is teaching Emily and Jacob that affection is something to be ashamed of, that caring about people is inappropriate. Charles's face went rigid with shock and fury. No domestic employee had ever spoken to him this way, had ever dared to question his parenting or suggest that his emotional distance was harmful. "You're out of line," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're way out of line." "Maybe," Grace replied, meeting his glare without flinching. "But someone needs to tell you that your children need more than money and rules. They need to feel loved, to feel safe expressing their emotions, to know that the people who care for them won't disappear without warning." The conversation was spiraling beyond any hope of recovery, but Grace found she couldn't stop. 6 months of swallowed words, of accepted humiliation, of loving without acknowledgement came pouring out like water through a broken dam. Charles moved to his hallway closet with jerky, furious motions, emerging with a pair of expensive leather shoes, Italian-made, probably worth more than Grace's monthly salary. Without warning, he hurled them across the room, the polished leather striking the wall near Grace's head before clattering to the floor. "Put them on if you dare," he snarled, his composure finally shattered completely. "Walk a mile in my shoes before you tell me how to raise my children. You have no idea what this family has been through, what I've sacrificed, what I've lost." Emily started crying in earnest now, frightened by her father's explosive anger and the flying shoes. Jacob had gone completely still, his small face pale with shock. Grace looked at both children, these precious souls she had come to love as her own, and felt her heart break for their terror and confusion. Without a word, Grace bent down and picked up the shoes Charles had thrown. They were beautiful, she had to admit, crafted from butter-soft leather, a warm brown color. She held them against her chest for a moment, feeling their weight, their quality, their expensive emptiness. "I have walked many paths in these shoes, Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, her voice carrying a dignity that his fury couldn't touch. "More than you'll ever see. I've walked through poverty and loss, through grief that would break most people, through doors that closed in my face because I wasn't educated enough, wealthy enough, important enough. I've walked through hospitals holding other people's children, through courtrooms fighting for custody I couldn't afford, through graveyards burying dreams I couldn't save." She paused, meeting his eyes with steady strength, while Emily's sobs filled the silence around them. "But most importantly," Grace continued, "I've walked through the lives of children who needed someone to love them without conditions, without resentment, without the emotional walls you've built to protect yourself from feeling anything real. Your children don't need someone who has walked in your shoes, Mr. Harrington. They need someone who can teach them how to walk in their own." Charles stood frozen, his anger momentarily stunned into silence by Grace's quiet eloquence. For just an instant, she thought she saw recognition flicker behind his eyes, an acknowledgement that her words contained truth he wasn't ready to face. But then his defenses slammed back into place, harder than before. "Pack your things," he said, his voice cold as winter steel. "I want you out of this house tonight. I'll have your final check cut and delivered tomorrow." The words hit Grace like physical blows, but she didn't flinch. She had known this moment was coming, had felt it building for weeks. What she hadn't anticipated was how much it would hurt the children who were now witnessing their father destroy another relationship right in front of their eyes. "Daddy, no!" Emily wailed, rushing to Grace's side and wrapping her small arms around her waist. "Grace can't leave. She's part of our family." "She's not family," Charles said brutally. "She's an employee and she's fired." Jacob joined his sister, clinging to Grace's other side while tears streamed down his cheeks. "Please don't go, Grace. Please don't leave us like Mommy did." The innocence of that statement, the child's instinctive understanding that losing Grace meant losing another source of maternal love, seemed to shake Charles slightly. For a moment, his rigid mask slipped, and Grace saw the broken man underneath, the father who was so afraid of his children experiencing loss again that he actively drove away anyone who might love them. But sympathy couldn't change what had been said and done. Grace gently disentangled herself from the children's desperate embrace, kneeling down to meet their eyes at their level. "I love you both so very much," she whispered, her own tears finally beginning to fall. "That will never change, no matter where I go or how much time passes. You are forever in my heart." She kissed each child's forehead. Breathing in their familiar scents one last time, Emily's strawberry shampoo, Jacob's lingering traces of chocolate milk and playground dirt. Then she stood, gathered what remained of her dignity, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, Grace turned back to look at Charles one final time. He stood rigid among the scattered toys and art supplies, his children crying at his feet, his home in emotional wreckage around him. "I hope someday you realize that loving your children isn't the same as losing your wife," Grace said softly. "And I hope it's not too late when you do." Then she was gone, climbing the stairs to pack her few belongings, while Emily and Jacob's heartbroken sobs echoed through the marble halls like ghosts. The beautiful Italian shoes remained on the playroom floor, abandoned and forgotten. A symbol of the emotional violence that had just torn apart 6 months of careful relationship building. Charles stood alone in the wreckage, his chest tight with conflicted emotions he couldn't name or process. The house felt different already, emptier, colder, as if Grace's departure had taken some essential warmth with it. But he couldn't admit that, couldn't acknowledge that he had just destroyed something precious in his determination to maintain control over his carefully ordered world. Upstairs, Grace packed her belongings with hands that shook only slightly. Her room, once a sanctuary filled with small tokens of her life with Emily and Jacob, now felt like a museum of lost connections. She wrapped Emily's ceramic horse carefully in tissue paper, tucking it deep in her suitcase alongside Jacob's handmade Father's Day card that he had secretly given her, because "you take care of us like a daddy too." As she folded her clothes, Grace found an envelope that had been slipped under her door sometime during the evening's chaos. Inside, Emily's careful handwriting spelled out a message that broke Grace's heart all over again. "Dear Grace, I love you more than all the stars. Please don't forget us. Love, Emily. P.S. Jacob says he loves you more than dinosaurs, which is a lot." Grace pressed the note to her chest and allowed herself to cry, not just for the job she was losing, but for the children she was being forced to abandon, for the family bonds that had been severed by one man's inability to heal his own wounded heart. An hour later, Grace walked out of the Harrington mansion for the last time, carrying her single suitcase and a heart full of love that had no place to go. The night air was thick with humidity and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic, but Grace felt utterly alone in the midst of 8 million people. Behind her, she could hear Emily calling her name from an upstairs window, begging her to come back, promising to be better, to cause less trouble, to need less love. The sound followed Grace down the sidewalk like an echo of her own childhood pain, and she had to force herself not to look back, knowing that seeing those small faces pressed against the glass would shatter what remained of her composure. Grace found a small hotel in Queens, a modest place that charged by the week and asked no questions about why a woman might arrive at midnight with tear-stained cheeks and nowhere else to go. She lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling while police sirens and garbage trucks provided the soundtrack to her heartbreak. For the first time in 6 months, Emily and Jacob fell asleep without bedtime stories, without lullabies, without someone who understood exactly how many glasses of water Jacob needed and which stuffed animals Emily required for nighttime comfort. The mansion's expensive silence stretched through the halls like a living thing, cold and hungry and utterly unchanged by one woman's love or one man's inability to recognize it. Charles poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and stood at his office window, looking out over Central Park while his children cried themselves to sleep 2 floors above him. He told himself he had made the right decision, that maintaining boundaries was crucial for Emily and Jacob's emotional development. But the scotch tasted like ash, and the park lights blurred together like tears he refused to shed. The ceramic horse lay forgotten on the playroom floor, a small testament to pure affection that had been judged inappropriate by someone who had forgotten how rare and precious such gifts could be. Grace spent the following days navigating the surreal landscape of sudden unemployment and heartbreak. She filed for unemployment benefits, scanned job listings, and tried to imagine working for another family when her heart remained wholly committed to Emily and Jacob. The thought of caring for other children felt like a betrayal, though she knew survival would eventually require it. Her small savings account, carefully managed on a nanny's modest salary, would cover basic expenses for perhaps 6 weeks if she was frugal. After that, she would need to find work quickly, which meant accepting whatever domestic position became available, regardless of whether it felt like a good fit. Grace found temporary housing in Bed-Stuy, a tiny studio apartment that cost twice what similar spaces had commanded before gentrification transformed her childhood neighborhood. The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable, but it was hers. A small sanctuary where she could grieve privately and try to rebuild her life from the pieces Charles Harrington had left behind. The first week was the hardest. Grace found herself reaching for her phone dozens of times each day, wanting to text Emily about something funny or send Jacob a picture of an interesting dog she had seen in the park. Her body maintained the rhythms of their household, waking at dawn to prepare breakfast, feeling restless during afternoon homework time, experiencing phantom bedtime anxiety when evening arrived without children to tuck in safely. She wondered constantly how Emily and Jacob were adjusting to her absence. Were they eating properly? Was Jacob still practicing his spelling words with the same determined intensity? Had Emily finished the watercolor series she had been working on all summer? Who was listening to their fears, celebrating their small victories, providing the emotional attuning that children needed to feel secure in the world? Grace tried to imagine Charles stepping into the nurturing role she had occupied, but the image wouldn't form properly. He loved his children, she was certain of that, but love and parenting required different skill sets. Charles excelled at providing security, education, and opportunities, but emotional availability had always fallen to Grace, a division of labor that had worked until his resentment of her importance in their lives destroyed it completely. On Friday of her first week away, Grace received a call from an employment agency specializing in domestic placements. A family on the Upper West Side needed immediate child care for their 2 young children. Both parents were doctors with unpredictable schedules, and their previous nanny had left without notice. "It's a good match," the agent assured Grace. "Similar age children. Excellent pay, very professional environment. They've specifically requested someone with experience in high net worth households." Grace accepted the interview, though something in her chest tightened at the phrase, "very professional environment." She had learned to recognize code language in domestic employment. Professional often meant emotionally distant, and boundaries frequently translated to, "don't love these children too much." The Patterson family lived in a renovated brownstone filled with modern art and expensive furniture that looked beautiful, but felt completely unwelcoming to children. Dr. Sarah Patterson was a pediatric surgeon, her husband, Dr. Michael Patterson, a radiologist, and together they had created a household that ran with hospital-like efficiency. "We need someone reliable and discreet," Dr. Sarah explained during the interview, barely glancing up from her tablet while 5-year-old Madison played quietly in the corner and 3-year-old Connor napped upstairs. "The children have very structured schedules, educational activities, tutoring, enrichment classes. We don't encourage unstructured play or excessive emotional dependency." Grace nodded and smiled and said all the appropriate things, but inside her heart was breaking all over again. These parents weren't cruel like Charles had become, but they shared his fundamental misunderstanding about what children truly needed to thrive. Madison sat surrounded by educational toys, but looked desperately lonely, her small face serious beyond her years. "Do the children have any particular interests or hobbies they enjoy?" Grace asked gently. "Madison is advanced in mathematics and Connor shows aptitude for early literacy," Dr. Michael replied, as if interests and academic achievements were synonymous. We prioritize structured learning over frivolous activities. Grace accepted the position because she needed the income, but as she walked home through Central Park that evening, she felt like she was betraying herself and the children she would be caring for. The Pattersons would pay her well to follow their rigid schedules and maintain their emotional distance, but Grace had learned over 6 months with Emily and Jacob that love couldn't be compartmentalized or regulated. That night, Grace sat on her small apartment's fire escape, looking out over the city lights and thinking about the different ways money could imprison both the wealthy and those who served them. Charles had used his wealth to buy control and emotional distance, while the Pattersons seemed to believe their professional success exempted them from the messy, irrational demands of parenting with an open heart. Meanwhile, Grace's lack of money forced her to accept employment that felt like slow emotional suicide, caring for other people's children while being explicitly forbidden from loving them the way they deserved to be loved. It was a peculiar kind of cruelty that masqueraded as professionalism, and Grace wondered how many domestic workers were slowly suffocating under the weight of such appropriate boundaries. 2 weeks into her position with the Pattersons, Grace received an unexpected phone call that changed everything. The caller ID showed a Manhattan number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was heartbreakingly familiar. "Grace?" Emily's whispered voice carried through the phone like a prayer. "Is this you? I got your number from the paper in your old room. Please don't hang up." Grace's heart stopped, then began racing like a hummingbird's wings. "Emily, sweetheart. How are you? Are you okay? Is Jacob okay?" "We miss you so much," Emily began crying immediately, her words tumbling together in a desperate rush. "Daddy hired Mrs. Chen, but she doesn't know our songs, and she makes Jacob eat vegetables he hates, and she doesn't understand that I need exactly 3 bedtime stories or I have nightmares about Mommy." Grace closed her eyes, pressed the phone against her ear, and felt her heart breaking all over again. "Oh, honey, I miss you too. So very much." "Can you come back?" Emily pleaded. "I'll be better, I promise. I'll never ask for gifts or hugs or anything that makes Daddy angry. I'll just be quiet and good, and maybe he'll let you love us again." The innocence of that statement, the child's assumption that she had somehow caused Grace's departure by being too needy, too affectionate, too human, nearly destroyed Grace's composure entirely. "Emily, listen to me very carefully," Grace said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "You did nothing wrong, nothing at all. You are perfect exactly as you are, and you deserve all the love in the world. What happened wasn't about you or Jacob. It was about grown-up problems that had nothing to do with how wonderful you both are." Emily sniffled on the other end of the line. "But if I wasn't wrong, why did Daddy make you leave? Why did he get so angry about the horse I made you?" Grace struggled to find age-appropriate words to explain adult emotional dysfunction and the complex dynamics of grief, control, and fear that had led to her dismissal. "Sometimes people get scared when they love someone too much," Grace said carefully. "Your daddy loved your mommy very much, and when she died, it hurt him so badly that he became afraid of loving anyone else that much again. He saw how much you and Jacob loved me, and it scared him because he thought it meant you might get hurt like he did." "But love doesn't hurt people," Emily protested with the clarity of childhood innocence. "Love makes people happy and safe and warm." "You're absolutely right, sweetheart," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Love is the most beautiful thing in the world. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." They talked for 20 more minutes, with Jacob eventually joining the conversation from an extension phone upstairs. Grace heard all about Mrs. Chen's strict schedules, Charles's longer work hours, and the peculiar sadness that had settled over their household since Grace's departure. "The house feels empty," Jacob said with the matter-of-fact honesty that 7-year-olds possessed. "Like when you hold your breath for too long and your chest hurts." Grace promised to always love them, to think about them every day, and to never forget the precious time they had shared together. But when the children begged her to return, she had to gently explain that she couldn't, not because she didn't want to, but because their father had made a decision that couldn't be undone. After the call ended, Grace sat in her tiny apartment and sobbed for an hour, mourning not just for Emily and Jacob, but for all the children in wealthy households who were being raised with everything money could buy, except the simple recognition that they were worthy of unconditional love. The next morning, Grace called in sick to the Pattersons and spent the day walking through Central Park, remembering all the afternoons she had brought Emily and Jacob here to feed ducks and play on the swings. Every playground reminded her of Jacob's laughter. Every flower bed made her think of Emily's artist eye for natural beauty. By evening, Grace had made a decision that surprised even her. She was going to write a letter to Charles Harrington, not begging for her job back, not demanding an apology, but offering him something he desperately needed, even if he couldn't recognize it yet: the truth about what his children required to heal and grow into emotionally healthy adults. Grace spent 3 days crafting the letter, choosing each word carefully, writing draft after draft until she had distilled her message to its essential elements. She wasn't trying to change Charles's mind about her employment. That bridge had been burned beyond repair. But she could perhaps plant seeds that might eventually grow into his own recognition of what he was denying Emily and Jacob in his determination to shield them from potential loss. The final letter was 2 pages long, handwritten on simple stationery that Grace had purchased specifically for this purpose. Her handwriting was careful, almost formal, but the emotions beneath the words pulsed with authentic concern and love. Dear Mr. Harrington, I hope this letter finds you and the children well. I wanted to write not to ask for anything, but to share some observations that might be helpful as you navigate the challenges of raising Emily and Jacob. In the months I spent caring for your children, I learned that they are both incredibly resilient and remarkably wise. Emily has an artist's soul and a protector's heart. She notices when others are sad and immediately tries to help. Jacob possesses a scientist's curiosity wrapped in a comedian's spirit. He finds wonder in ordinary moments and shares that joy generously. Both children are healing from their mother's loss in their own ways, but they need permission to grieve openly rather than pretending they are fine to spare your feelings. Children's emotions are not smaller versions of adult emotions. They are often larger, more intense, and require patient guidance to navigate healthily. Emily sometimes has nightmares because she's afraid you will leave too. Jacob occasionally acts younger than his age because regression is a normal response to loss and change. These behaviors aren't problems to be solved through stricter schedules or more educational activities. They are communications from children who need reassurance that they are safe and loved unconditionally. I understand your desire to protect them from further loss, but isolation is not protection. Emily and Jacob need to know that love is worth the risk, that opening their hearts to others is brave and necessary, not dangerous. They are watching you to learn how to navigate relationships, and they need to see that vulnerability is strength, not weakness. Please don't be afraid of their capacity to love deeply. It is not a flaw to be corrected, but a gift to be celebrated. Your children have enormous hearts precisely because they experienced profound love from their mother before losing her. That love taught them how to love others generously. It is her greatest legacy to them. I will always cherish the time I spent with Emily and Jacob. They taught me about resilience, wonder, and the healing power of laughter. I hope someday they will understand that adult decisions sometimes hurt everyone involved, but love itself never diminishes, no matter how far apart people become. Please give them both my love and tell them I think about them every day. With sincere hopes for your family's healing. Grace. P.S. Emily's ceramic horse sits on my nightstand, the first thing I see each morning and the last thing I see each night. It reminds me daily that love multiplies when shared, never diminishes. Jacob's math homework from June still makes me smile. His joy in learning was infectious and beautiful. Grace sealed the letter in a simple white envelope and walked to the Harrington mansion on a Sunday afternoon when she knew Charles would likely be home. She didn't ring the doorbell or attempt to deliver it personally. Instead, She slipped it under the massive front door and walked away quickly, not wanting to risk an encounter that might undermine the letter's quiet dignity. She never expected a response, and she didn't receive one. But 3 weeks later, Emily called again, this time with news that made Grace's heart soar with quiet satisfaction. "Grace, guess what? Daddy said we can make a garden on the roof, and he's going to help us build it instead of Mrs. Chen. And he said maybe we could have a picnic up there when the vegetables start growing." The changes were small but significant. Charles was beginning to engage with his children's interests rather than dismissing them as frivolous. Grace's letter hadn't performed a miracle, but it had apparently planted a seed that was starting to sprout. Over the following months, Emily's phone calls became a precious lifeline for Grace. She learned that Charles had relaxed some of his rigid scheduling, allowing more unstructured time for play and creativity. He had also begun treating the children's emotional expressions with more patience, asking about their dreams and fears rather than dismissing them as childish concerns. "He still works a lot," Emily reported during one call. "But sometimes he comes home early just to have dinner with us. And last week he read us bedtime stories for 3 whole nights." Grace celebrated these victories privately, understanding that Charles was slowly learning to parent with his heart as well as his protective instincts. The progress was gradual and imperfect, but it represented hope for Emily and Jacob's emotional future. Meanwhile, Grace continued working for the Pattersons, though she had begun subtly expanding her role beyond their rigid expectations. Madison and Connor were starved for emotional connection, and Grace found ways to provide warmth and playfulness within the family's structured parameters. She taught Madison to braid friendship bracelets during supervised study time and showed Connor how to build elaborate block towers during approved play periods. The children responded to Grace's gentle rebellion with the kind of blossoming that happens when flowers finally receive adequate sunshine. Madison began smiling more freely, and Connor's vocabulary exploded as he started sharing his observations about the world around him, rather than simply following directions. But Grace's heart remained partially elsewhere, still connected to 2 children in a mansion across town who had taught her that love was always worth the risk, even when it ended in heartbreak. 6 months after her dismissal from the Harrington household, Grace's carefully constructed new life was disrupted by another unexpected phone call, this time from Charles himself. "Grace?" His voice sounded different, softer, uncertain in a way she had never heard before. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. We need to talk." Grace's heart began racing, but she kept her voice steady. "Is everything all right? Are the children okay?" "They're fine," Charles said quickly. "Better than fine, actually. Emily won 2nd place in a citywide art competition, and Jacob joined the school chess club. They're both thriving." "I'm so glad," Grace replied sincerely, wondering why Charles was sharing this good news with her instead of celebrating with his family. "Grace, I found your letter," Charles continued, his words coming slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. I found it months ago, but I wasn't ready to understand what you were trying to tell me. But last week, something happened that made everything clear." Grace waited, sensing that Charles needed to share whatever had prompted this unexpected call. "Jacob had a panic attack at school," Charles continued, his voice tight with remembered fear. "Completely out of nowhere, at least that's what I thought. The school called, and by the time I got there, he was hyperventilating, crying, totally inconsolable." Grace's heart clenched with worry. "What triggered it?" "His teacher had announced that she was leaving at the end of the school year," Charles said quietly. "Jacob became convinced that everyone he loved was going to disappear without warning. The school counselor spent 2 hours helping him calm down, and afterward, she asked to speak with me privately." Charles paused, and Grace could hear him struggling with emotions that were clearly difficult to process. "She asked me about the transitions in Jacob's life, about how we had handled loss and change as a family. When I mentioned that that their nanny had left our employment." Grace, the look on that counselor's face. She didn't say it directly, but I could see her putting the pieces together. Grace closed her eyes, imagining Jacob's terror at the prospect of another sudden abandonment, his small mind unable to distinguish between a teacher changing jobs and the more profound losses he had already experienced. She recommended family therapy, Charles continued, said that Jacob's anxiety was likely related to unresolved grief and fear of abandonment. She suggested that children who experience multiple unexpected separations from caregivers often develop anxiety disorders that can persist into adulthood if not addressed properly. The implications of this hung in the air between them. That Charles's decision to fire Grace abruptly had compounded Jacob's existing trauma rather than protecting him from it. "I've been thinking about everything you wrote in your letter," Charles said, his voice growing stronger, "about how the children need to feel safe loving people, about how hiding from grief doesn't heal it. I think I've been so afraid of losing anyone else that I've been pushing away everyone who might matter." Grace felt tears building behind her eyes but kept her voice steady. "Children are incredibly resilient, Charles. Jacob can heal from this anxiety, especially with proper support." "That's actually why I'm calling," Charles said, his tone becoming more formal, as if he were preparing for a business negotiation. "The family therapist we've started seeing, she thinks it would be beneficial for Jacob to have closure with you. Not necessarily a reunion, but a chance to process your departure in a healthy way rather than carrying it as an unresolved trauma." Grace's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What kind of closure are you thinking about?" "A meeting," Charles said carefully. "Supervised, structured, focused on Jacob's healing rather than other considerations. The therapist thinks it might help him understand that your leaving wasn't his fault, that sometimes adults make decisions that have nothing to do with children's behavior or worth." The offer was presented clinically, professionally, with boundaries clearly established before Grace could even respond. But beneath Charles's careful language, she heard something else. A man beginning to recognize that his attempts to control emotion through structure and distance had caused more harm than the vulnerability he was trying to avoid. "I think that would be good for Jacob," Grace replied carefully. "And for Emily, too, if she's interested." "Emily," Charles's voice softened when he mentioned his daughter. "Emily asks about you constantly. She's been seeing the therapist, too, working through her own anxiety about people leaving. She's become almost obsessively helpful at home, as if being perfect might prevent future losses." Grace's heart broke for Emily, recognizing the little girl's attempt to control an uncontrollable world through exemplary behavior. It was a common response to trauma. Children often believed they could prevent bad things from happening if they were just good enough, quiet enough, trouble-free enough. "Children shouldn't have to earn love through perfect behavior," Grace said gently. "Emily needs to know that she's lovable exactly as she is, even when she's cranky or difficult or having a bad day." "The therapist said something similar," Charles admitted. "She's helping me understand that unconditional love isn't the same as unconditional approval, that I can set boundaries and expectations while still making sure the children know their worth isn't dependent on their performance." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Charles sharing details about the children's progress in therapy and his own growing awareness of how his grief had affected his parenting. Grace listened with a mixture of pride and sadness, proud that Emily and Jacob were getting the emotional support they needed, sad that it had taken a crisis to make Charles recognize what had been missing from their family dynamic. When they finally scheduled the meeting for the following weekend, Grace hung up the phone and sat in her small apartment, processing the unexpected opportunity to see Emily and Jacob again. She wasn't naive enough to think this meeting might lead to renewed employment. Charles had made it clear that structural boundaries were firmly in place. But the chance to help heal the children's trauma, to offer them closure and reassurance about their own worth, felt like a gift she hadn't dared hope for. The week passed slowly, with Grace alternately excited and nervous about the upcoming reunion. She carefully chose her outfit, professional but warm, approachable but not presumptuous. She rehearsed what she might say, how she could best serve Jacob's healing while honoring the boundaries Charles had established. On Saturday morning, Grace took the subway to Manhattan, emerging from the station near Central Park with butterflies dancing in her stomach. The family therapist's office was in a brownstone near the Natural History Museum, a warm space filled with comfortable furniture and children's artwork. Grace arrived first, spending a few minutes in the waiting room looking at picture books clearly chosen to help children process difficult emotions, stories about divorce, death, moving homes, and other transitions that could feel overwhelming to young minds. When Emily and Jacob walked into the office with Charles, Grace's heart nearly stopped. Emily had grown at least 2 inches, her hair longer and her face more mature, but her eyes still held the same artistic intensity Grace remembered. Jacob looked older too, his limbs longer and his face leaner, but he still possessed that spark of curiosity and mischief that had always delighted Grace. Both children stared at Grace for a moment, as if she might be a mirage that would disappear if they looked away. Then Emily ran across the room and threw herself into Grace's arms, followed immediately by Jacob, and for a perfect moment, Grace was surrounded by the children she had loved and lost, breathing in their familiar scents and feeling their warm weight against her chest. "I missed you so much," Emily whispered fiercely, clinging to Grace as if she could prevent another departure through sheer force of will. "I carried your letter in my backpack every day," Jacob added, his voice muffled against Grace's shoulder. "The one you wrote me about being brave even when you're scared." Grace looked over the children's heads to find Charles watching this reunion with an expression she couldn't quite read, regret perhaps, mixed with recognition and something that might have been longing. For just a moment, their eyes met across the room, and Grace saw the man he might have been if grief hadn't built such high walls around his heart. Dr. Morrison, the family therapist, was a gentlewoman in her 50s who specialized in helping children process trauma and loss. She guided the conversation with expertise, helping Jacob articulate his fears about people leaving while reassuring him that Grace's departure hadn't been his fault. "Sometimes adults make decisions that hurt everyone involved," Grace explained, holding Jacob's hand while he processed this difficult concept. "Your daddy wasn't trying to hurt me or you when he asked me to leave. He was trying to protect you from feeling sad if I ever left on my own. But protecting people from sadness isn't always the kindest thing to do, because it can also protect them from love." Emily listened intently, her mature 9-year-old mind working through the complex emotions surrounding loss and attachment. "So you left because Daddy was scared we loved you too much?" Grace glanced at Charles before answering, seeing him nod slightly in permission to share this truth. "Your daddy loved your mommy very much, and when she died, it hurt him so badly that he became afraid of anyone else in your family getting hurt that same way. He thought if you didn't love me too much, it wouldn't hurt if something happened to me." "But we did love you," Jacob said matter-of-factly, "and it did hurt when you left, so being scared didn't work." Dr. Morrison smiled at Jacob's innocent wisdom. "That's very insightful, Jacob. Sometimes trying to avoid pain just creates different kinds of pain instead." The session continued for 90 minutes, with both children expressing their feelings about Grace's departure while she reassured them repeatedly of their worth and lovability. Grace shared memories of special moments they had shared, reinforcing the positive aspects of their relationship, while helping them understand that love could continue even when people were apart. "You will always be in my heart," Grace told them as the session concluded. "Even when we can't see each other, I think about you every day and feel proud of how you're growing into such amazing people." As they prepared to leave, Emily pressed something into Grace's hand, a small wrapped package that felt like a book. "I made this for you," she whispered. "Daddy said I could give it to you today." Grace opened the package carefully to find a hand-bound book filled with Emily's artwork, watercolor paintings of their herb garden, pencil sketches of Jacob playing chess, and on the final page, a portrait of Grace reading bedtime stories with both children curled against her sides. The title, written in Emily's careful cursive, read, Grace's Love Stories. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received," Grace said, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed in front of the children. Jacob reached into his backpack and pulled out a small wooden box. "I made this in woodworking class. It's for your special things so they don't get lost." The box was simple but lovingly crafted, clearly the product of many hours of careful work by small hands. Inside, Jacob had carved Grace in uneven letters that made it more precious than the finest calligraphy. As the children hugged Grace goodbye, she felt something shift in her chest, not the sharp pain of heartbreak, but something warmer and more complex. The love she felt for Emily and Jacob hadn't diminished during their separation. If anything, it had deepened into something more mature and selfless. She could love them completely while accepting that her role in their lives had changed, that her primary care had given way to something less visible but equally profound. Charles lingered for a moment after the children left with Dr. Morrison to pick out new books from her waiting room library. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for helping them understand, for loving them the way you did. I can see now that your presence in their lives was a gift, not a threat." Grace nodded, accepting his gratitude with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout their difficult history. "They're remarkable children, Charles. You should be very proud." "I am," he replied, "and I'm beginning to understand that their capacity for love is something to celebrate, not fear." As Grace walked back through Central Park toward the subway, she felt lighter than she had in months. The closure session hadn't repaired all the damage or resolved all the pain, but it had provided something precious, the knowledge that her love for Emily and Jacob had mattered, that her care had helped shape them into the resilient, loving children they were becoming. The following months brought gradual healing for everyone involved. Emily and Jacob continued their work with Dr. Morrison, learning healthy ways to process loss and express their emotions. Grace returned to her work with the Pattersons, but found herself better able to provide emotional warmth within their structured environment, having processed some of her own grief about loving and losing. Charles began dating again, tentatively, carefully, but with a growing recognition that emotional risk was necessary for emotional growth. He sent Grace occasional updates about the children's achievements, brief but warm messages that acknowledged her continued importance in their lives, even from a distance. Grace kept Emily's book and Jacob's box on her nightstand, daily reminders that love multiplied when shared rather than diminished, that investing her heart in their lives had been worth every moment of pain their separation had caused. 2 years after that first closure session, Grace received an invitation that changed everything once again. The envelope was thick, elegant, addressed in Emily's now mature handwriting to Grace Chen, our forever heart mama. Inside was a formal invitation to Emily's middle school graduation party, but more importantly, a handwritten note from Charles that made Grace's hands tremble as she read it. "Dear Grace, Emily and Jacob have asked if you would consider returning to work for our family. Not as their nanny, they're old enough now to manage most things independently, but as our household manager and family coordinator. The job would involve organizing schedules, coordinating activities, managing household staff, and yes, providing the emotional guidance and support that you always gave so naturally. I won't pretend there haven't been other nannies and housekeepers over the past 2 years. There have been several, all competent, all professional, all ultimately unable to provide what our family really needed. Emily and Jacob are polite to them, but never truly comfortable, never fully themselves the way they were with you. I've learned through therapy that my fear of loss was creating more loss, that trying to protect my children from attachment was actually depriving them of the secure relationships they needed to heal and thrive. Dr. Morrison has helped me understand that vulnerability is courage, not weakness, and that love is worth the risk of eventual grief. The position would come with significant increases in salary and benefits, a reflection of your true value to our family rather than the arbitrary boundaries I once imposed. You would have your own suite with complete privacy, 3 weeks paid vacation, health insurance, and a retirement contribution that reflects our hope this would be a long-term arrangement. But more importantly, you would have the formal recognition and respect you always deserved, but never received from me. Emily and Jacob need consistency and emotional security, and they have never stopped believing that you provided both better than anyone else. I hope you'll consider this opportunity. Our family has never been complete without you. With deep respect and gratitude, Charles. P.S. Emily wants to show you her latest art series, and Jacob has learned to cook your pancake recipe. The herb garden you planted together is still thriving on the roof. We've expanded it considerably and would love your guidance in planning next season's vegetables. Grace read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and possibility. Charles wasn't just offering her a job, he was offering her a place in their family structure with dignity, respect, and acknowledgement of her true value. The boy who had once thrown shoes at her in anger had grown into a man capable of admitting his mistakes and making genuine amends. But more than that, Grace realized as she sat in her small Brooklyn apartment, Charles was offering her the chance to love Emily and Jacob openly, completely, without hiding her affection or minimizing her importance in their lives. After 2 years of loving them from a distance, the possibility of daily presence felt almost too wonderful to trust. Grace called the Harrington house that evening, her heart pounding as she dialed the familiar number. Emily answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Grace, Daddy said he sent you a letter. Are you coming home? Please say you're coming home." The word home hit Grace like a physical embrace. The Harrington mansion had never truly felt like home during her first employment there. She had been too conscious of her outsider status, too careful about maintaining appropriate boundaries. But the idea of returning as a valued family member rather than mere domestic staff transformed the entire proposition. "I'd love to come home, sweetheart," Grace said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "If you're sure that's what you really want." "It's what we've wanted for 2 whole years," Emily said fiercely. "Jacob and I ask Daddy every month if you can come back, and he always said maybe someday, but now someday is finally here." Jacob grabbed the phone from his sister. "Grace, I learned calculus, and I'm teaching myself French, and I wrote you letters every week, but Daddy said we should wait to send them until you could come back for real. I have a whole box full of them to give you." Charles came on the line a few minutes later, after the children had exhausted themselves, sharing 2 years' worth of news and achievements. "Have you had time to consider the offer?" he asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that hadn't been there during their first professional relationship. "I accept," Grace said without hesitation. "When would you like me to start?" "As soon as possible," Charles replied. "The children have been planning your welcome home party for months, even though we weren't sure you'd say yes. Emily has repainted the guest suite in colors she thought you'd like, and Jacob has been practicing cooking to surprise you with dinner." Grace laughed through her tears, overwhelmed by the evidence of how much she'd been missed and wanted. "I can give 2 weeks' notice to my current family and start after that." "Perfect," Charles said. "Grace, I want you to know that things will be different this time. You won't be just an employee in this house, you'll be family. The children need that, and honestly, so do I." The admission was quiet but profound, acknowledging that Charles himself had missed Grace's presence, had recognized the emotional stability she brought to his household and his own life. 2 weeks later, Grace stood once again in the marble foyer of the Harrington mansion, but everything felt different now. Emily and Jacob rushed down the spiral staircase like a small avalanche of excitement, both taller and more mature, but still essentially the same loving children she had left behind. The mansion itself had changed too, warmer somehow, filled with family photos that now included casual shots alongside formal portraits, children's artwork displayed prominently instead of hidden away. Grace's own belongings had been moved into a beautiful suite on the second floor, not the third-floor staff quarters she had occupied before, symbolically and practically placing her within the family space rather than separate from it. Charles greeted her with a handshake that lingered longer than necessary, his eyes holding a warmth she had never seen there before. "Welcome home, Grace." The word home from his lips carried the weight of genuine invitation rather than grudging accommodation. Grace understood that she was being offered not just employment, but belonging, the chance to love Emily and Jacob openly while receiving acknowledgement and respect in return. That first evening back, Grace sat between the children on the living room sofa, reading aloud from a new book while Charles worked quietly at his laptop nearby. The scene was domestic and peaceful, filled with the kind of easy contentment that comes from being exactly where you're meant to be. During a pause between chapters, Emily curled closer to Grace's side. "Promise you'll never leave us again." Grace looked across the room to meet Charles's eyes, seeing his slight nod of encouragement before she answered. "I promise, sweetheart. This is my home now, with you and Jacob and your daddy. Nothing could make me leave my family again." The word family hung in the air like a benediction, officially acknowledging what had always been true in the children's hearts and Grace's own. Charles smiled from his armchair, and for the first time since Margaret's death, the Harrington household felt complete. As the months passed, Grace settled into her new role with increasing joy and confidence. She managed the household with efficient, loving care, coordinated the children's increasingly complex schedules, and provided the emotional anchoring that allowed everyone to flourish. Emily's artwork became bolder and more experimental, her confidence growing as Grace encouraged artistic risks and creative exploration. Jacob joined the school debate team and started a neighborhood chess club, his natural leadership abilities blossoming under Grace's supportive guidance. Most remarkably, Charles began participating more actively in family life rather than simply managing it from a distance. Grace's return had somehow given him permission to be more emotionally present, to risk loving openly rather than hiding behind professional boundaries and rigid schedules. They established new family traditions: Sunday morning pancake competitions, evening walks through Central Park, collaborative cooking sessions where everyone contributed to elaborate weekend dinners. Grace photographed these moments carefully, creating family albums that documented their official history as a chosen family rather than an employer-employee arrangement. One year after Grace's return, Charles approached her with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking about legal adoption," he said quietly during one of their evening conversations after the children were asleep. "Not of you, obviously, but I'd like to legally establish your role in Emily and Jacob's lives. If something happened to me, I want them to have the security of knowing you'd remain their caregiver, their family." Grace felt her heart stop completely. "Charles, that's incredibly generous. But are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Charles replied. "You've been their mother in every way that matters for years now. It's time that love was recognized legally as well as emotionally." The paperwork took months to complete, but eventually Grace found herself in a courthouse, signing documents that officially made her Emily and Jacob's legal guardian in the event of Charles's death or incapacitation. More importantly, the documents recognized her as family in formal legal terms, ending forever the question of whether her love and care were temporary or conditional. Emily and Jacob, now 12 and 10 respectively, understood the significance of these legal documents. They had chosen family name rings made from simple silver bands, each engraved with Harrington Chen Family Est, 2023, acknowledging both Charles's biological parenthood and Grace's equal role in their lives. The ceremony was small, held in the mansion's garden with Dr. Morrison officiating and a few close friends witnessing. Grace wore the same dress she had worn to Emily's middle school graduation, and Charles gave a speech about the different ways families could be formed, through birth, through choice, through love that transcends traditional boundaries. "Grace chose to love our family when she didn't have to," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. And today, we're choosing to love her officially, legally, permanently. She has been Emily and Jacob's mother in every way that matters. And now, the world will recognize what we have always known. Emily presented Grace with a painting she had been working on for months, a family portrait showing all four of them in the rooftop garden, surrounded by vegetables and flowers and warm golden light. The title, painted in elegant script along the bottom, read, "Grace's Love Grows Here." Jacob's gift was a wooden box similar to the first one he had made, but larger and more sophisticated, crafted in high school woodshop class over the course of an entire semester. Inside, he had placed every letter Grace had ever written him, every photo they had taken together, every small memento of their relationship since her first day in their household. "For keeping our family memories safe," he said as she opened it, "so they never get lost again." Years passed with the steady rhythm of a family truly at peace with itself. Emily graduated high school as valedictorian, her acceptance to art school celebrated with a party that filled the mansion with laughter and pride. Jacob followed his sister's academic excellence, earning early admission to MIT with thoughts of studying sustainable technology and environmental engineering. Grace continued managing the household, but her role evolved as the children grew more independent. She returned to school herself, earning a degree in child development and family therapy, inspired by Dr. Morrison's work and her own experiences with complex family dynamics. Charles and Grace never became romantically involved. Their relationship remained grounded in shared love for Emily and Jacob and mutual respect for the different but complementary roles they played in their family. Charles eventually did remarry, choosing a warm, emotionally intelligent woman named Sarah, who embraced Grace as family from the very beginning, understanding that love multiplied rather than divided when shared generously. When Emily's first gallery show opened in Manhattan, the program included a dedication that made Grace weep with pride. "To Grace Chen Harrington, who taught me that art is love made visible and that family is love made permanent. Thank you for showing me that the most beautiful creations come from hearts brave enough to remain open." Jacob's college graduation speech, delivered to hundreds of MIT families, included a section about the different types of intelligence required for success. "My mother Grace taught me that emotional intelligence is just as important as mathematical ability, that solving human problems requires the same creativity and persistence as solving engineering challenges. The future needs scientists who understand that technical solutions must serve human hearts." On Grace's 60th birthday, the family threw a celebration that filled the mansion with friends, neighbors, and colleagues from every stage of her life. The centerpiece was a photo retrospective that Charles and Sarah had compiled, dozens of pictures showing Grace's journey from uncertain young nanny to confident family matriarch, from invisible domestic worker to celebrated community member. Dr. Morrison attended the party, bringing with her a framed certificate recognizing Grace's volunteer work with other domestic workers and caregivers who needed support navigating complex employment relationships. Grace had started a support group for household workers, helping them understand their rights while teaching them to advocate for respect and fair treatment. "You've transformed your own painful experience into healing for others," Dr. Morrison told Grace during the party. "That's the highest form of resilience, turning trauma into wisdom that serves the community." Emily, now 24 and establishing herself as a professional artist, used her birthday speech to announce a scholarship fund she and Jacob were establishing in Grace's name. The Grace Chen Harrington Foundation would provide educational opportunities for children from working-class families, ensuring that financial limitations wouldn't prevent talented young people from pursuing their dreams. "Grace taught us that love is action, not just feeling," Emily explained to the gathered crowd. "She showed us that luxury means nothing without love, that wealth is meaningless without generosity, that success requires serving others rather than just serving ourselves." Jacob, now finishing his PhD in environmental engineering, added his own tribute. Grace built our family through patience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to our happiness. Now we want to build opportunities for other families to experience that same stability and love. Charles stood to make the final speech of the evening, his hair now completely silver, but his eyes bright with contentment and pride. 15 years ago, I was a man trapped by my own fear of loss, so terrified of feeling pain again that I was causing pain instead of preventing it. Grace came into our lives when Emily and Jacob needed a mother, and I needed to remember how to be a father. She loved my children when I had forgotten how to love them properly, and she stayed patient with me while I learned to become worthy of the family she was helping me build. He paused, looking directly at Grace with tears in his eyes. The shoes I threw at you that night, those expensive, empty symbols of wealth without wisdom, they represented everything that was wrong with my priorities. But you caught them, held them, and somehow transformed that moment of cruelty into an opportunity for growth. You showed me that love requires courage, that family is built through daily choices rather than biological accidents. That home is created by hearts willing to stay open despite the risk of breaking. The crowd erupted in applause, but Charles raised his hand to continue. Grace, you gave my children the gift of feeling worthy of unconditional love. You gave me the gift of learning to love without fear. You gave our entire family the gift of understanding that the most important things in life can't be bought or controlled. They can only be offered freely and received with gratitude. Grace stood to respond, her heart so full she could barely speak. Looking out over the crowd of faces, Emily and Jacob beaming with pride, Charles and Sarah holding hands, Dr. Morrison smiling with professional satisfaction. Dozens of friends and colleagues who had become part of her extended family. She felt the profound completion of a journey that had begun with heartbreak and humiliation. When I first came to work for the Harrington family, Grace began, her voice steady despite her emotional overwhelm, I thought I was just taking another job caring for other people's children. I had no idea I was walking into my own life, my own purpose, my own family. She looked at Emily and Jacob, both adults now, but still the children of her heart. You two taught me that motherhood isn't about giving birth. It's about giving daily love, support, and guidance. You showed me that family bonds are created through shared meals, bedtime stories, homework struggles, and celebrating every small victory together. Turning to Charles, Grace continued, you taught me that people can change, that hearts can heal, that it's never too late to choose love over fear. You gave me the gift of belonging, of being seen and valued for who I truly am rather than what I could provide. Grace's voice grew stronger as she addressed the entire gathering. But most importantly, all of you have taught me that love multiplies when shared rather than diminishing. Every child I've cared for, every family I've supported, every friend who has welcomed me into their lives, all of these relationships have made my heart larger, not smaller. Love is the only investment that always pays dividends, the only treasure that grows when spent freely. She paused, looking around the room that had once felt cold and unwelcoming, but now radiated with warmth and belonging. This house, this family, this life we've built together, it's proof that the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult soil. Pain can become wisdom, rejection can become resilience, and heartbreak can become the foundation for deeper, more meaningful love. Grace's final words were addressed directly to the younger people in the crowd, children of friends, college students, young adults just beginning their own journeys toward understanding what family meant. Don't be afraid to love deeply, even when it might hurt. Don't let fear of loss prevent you from opening your hearts to the people who need your care. And remember that family is found in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones you choose, rather than the ones you're born to. As the party wound down and guests gradually departed, Grace found herself alone in the mansion's garden, looking up at the stars barely visible through Manhattan's glow. The herb garden she and Emily had planted so many years ago had grown into a thriving rooftop farm, providing vegetables for the family and donations to local food banks. Emily and Jacob joined her, settling on either side of the garden bench like bookends around the woman who had shaped their lives. "Are you happy, Grace?" Emily asked quietly. "Really, truly happy with how everything turned out?" Grace considered the question seriously, reviewing the journey from that first day when she had arrived with a faded suitcase and desperate hope. She thought about the pain of dismissal, the months of loneliness, the gradual healing, and the ultimate recognition and belonging she had found. "Happy doesn't seem like a big enough word," Grace replied finally. "I'm grateful. I'm fulfilled. I'm at peace with the choices I've made and the love I've given. Most importantly, I'm proud of the people you've both become and the family we've created together." Jacob leaned against her shoulder, still seeking comfort from the woman who had provided it unconditionally for so many years. "Do you ever regret staying, even when everything was hard and Daddy was being mean?" Grace wrapped her arms around both young people, feeling the weight and warmth of lives well lived and love well shared. "Never," she said firmly. "Every difficult moment led to this beautiful life. Every tear was worth the joy that came after. Every moment of doubt was worth the certainty I feel now about where I belong." She looked up at the stars, thinking about all the domestic workers and caregivers around the world who were still fighting for recognition, respect, and the right to love the children they cared for without fear of arbitrary dismissal. "But I hope our story inspires other families to do better," Grace added, "to see their caregivers as human beings worthy of dignity, to understand that love is a gift that should be celebrated rather than feared, to build families based on choice and commitment rather than just biology and ownership." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's why we started the foundation, right? To help other families find what we found, but maybe without all the pain first?" "Exactly," Grace smiled. "To help create a world where love is recognized and valued wherever it's found." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Grace reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. She had begun as a poor girl from Queens with few prospects beyond domestic work, but love had transformed her into a family matriarch, community leader, and advocate for others whose stories paralleled her own difficult beginning. The ceramic horse Emily had made her so many years ago still sat on Grace's nightstand, now accompanied by dozens of other treasures, photos, letters, small gifts, and mementos of a life fully lived in service to love. Jacob's wooden box had been joined by others, each filled with memories of different stages of their family's growth. But beyond the physical tokens, Grace carried something more precious, the knowledge that her love had mattered, that her presence had shaped lives, that choosing to remain open-hearted despite pain and rejection had ultimately led to belonging and recognition she could never have imagined. At 65, Grace finally retired from active household management, though she remained an integral part of the family structure. Emily and Jacob, both successful in their chosen fields, made sure Grace wanted for nothing, not from obligation, but from the genuine desire to care for the woman who had cared for them so completely. Charles and Sarah bought a small house in the Berkshires where Grace could garden to her heart's content, surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that had always brought her peace. But she also maintained an apartment in the city, allowing her to remain close to Emily and Jacob as they built their own families. When Emily married a fellow artist in a ceremony where Grace walked her down the aisle alongside Charles, the symbolism was clear. This young woman had been shaped by two parents who loved her equally, even if their roles in her life had developed through different paths. Jacob's wedding was smaller but equally meaningful, with Grace delivering a reading about love that mentioned how family bonds are strengthened through choice and commitment rather than weakened by changes and challenges. As grandchildren began arriving, Emily's daughter Rose, Jacob's twins Daniel and Margaret, Grace found herself once again surrounded by small voices calling her name, tiny hands reaching for comfort, young minds eager for the stories and wisdom she had spent a lifetime accumulating. But this time, there was no question about her role. No confusion about boundaries, no fear about loving too deeply. She was Grandma Grace officially, legally, and emotionally, a title she wore with pride and joy. The children grew up hearing stories about the early days, about how Grace had come to be part of their family, about the importance of recognizing love wherever it appeared and honoring the people who provided care and comfort without asking for anything in return except the chance to keep giving. Rose's first school project about family heroes featured Grace prominently, with a crayon drawing of her surrounded by vegetables from the garden and the words, "My Grandma Grace chose to love us before she had to, and that makes love even more special." On Grace's 70th birthday, the family celebration included 4 generations of people whose lives she had touched, from Emily and Jacob to their children to other domestic workers she had mentored over the years. The day was filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from a life lived with purpose and meaning. Charles, now in his 70s and dealing with health challenges that reminded everyone of life's fragility, used his birthday speech to make an important announcement. "Grace, you've given our family 30 years of unconditional love and support. You've raised our children, managed our home, and helped us become better versions of ourselves. But most importantly, you've shown us that family is built through daily choices to stay committed to each other's well-being and happiness." He paused, looking at Emily and Jacob for encouragement before continuing. "Sarah and I have decided to establish the Grace Chen Harrington Institute for Family Studies, a research center focused on supporting non-traditional families and advocating for domestic workers' rights. The institute will be housed at Columbia University and funded by our family foundation in perpetuity." Grace gasped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this recognition and the implications for other families struggling with similar challenges to those her own family had faced. "Charles, that's incredible, but..." "No buts," Emily interrupted, grinning through tears. "You've spent your entire adult life caring for others. Now it's our turn to make sure your legacy continues helping families long after we're all gone." Jacob nodded enthusiastically. "The Institute will provide counseling services, legal advocacy, and educational programs. But it will also document stories like ours, families that succeeded because they chose love over fear, because they recognized that biology is just one way to build lasting bonds." The Institute opened 2 years later, with Grace serving as its founding director despite her initial protests that she wasn't qualified for such an important role. Her first initiative was an oral history project, collecting stories from domestic workers, caregivers, and non-traditional families about their experiences with love, loss, and belonging. Grace's own story became the centerpiece of the Institute's work, not as a fairy tale about overcoming adversity, but as a realistic example of how persistence, dignity, and open-hearted commitment could transform difficult circumstances into profound happiness. The Institute's motto, chosen by Grace herself, read, "Love multiplies when shared, never diminishes, and family is built through hearts willing to stay open despite the risk of breaking." As Grace approached her 75th birthday, she began experiencing the health challenges that come with age. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to remind everyone that her time as the family's anchor wouldn't last forever. Emily and Jacob, now in their 40s with teenagers of their own, made sure Grace received the best possible medical care while also ensuring she remained as independent and dignified as possible. They had learned from her example that love meant respecting someone's autonomy while providing support, not taking over their life out of excessive worry. Grace spent her days writing memoirs that would eventually become a book about domestic work, family formation, and the different ways people could build meaningful lives together. She also continued her work with the Institute, mentoring younger advocates and sharing her hard-won wisdom about navigating complex family dynamics. On quiet evenings, Grace would sit in her garden, surrounded by the vegetables and flowers she had tended for decades, thinking about the extraordinary journey her life had taken. From invisible domestic worker to celebrated family matriarch, from someone whose love was dismissed as inappropriate to someone whose love was recognized as foundational, the transformation still somewhat amazed her. But more than personal satisfaction, Grace felt deep gratitude for the opportunity to have loved so completely and to have that love returned and honored. She had raised children who became compassionate adults, supported a man through his journey from grief to healing, and helped create a family structure that demonstrated love's power to transcend traditional boundaries. The ceramic horse Emily had made her as a child still held a place of honor on Grace's nightstand, now joined by photos of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and the hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the Institute's work. These tangible reminders of love given and received provided daily confirmation that her life had mattered in ways both large and small. When Grace's health finally began to decline more seriously, the family rallied around her with the same devotion she had always shown them. Emily took a sabbatical from her art career to coordinate care. Jacob used his engineering background to make Grace's home as comfortable and accessible as possible, and Charles spent his remaining healthy years making sure Grace knew how much her presence had meant to their family's happiness. On Grace's final day, she was surrounded by 4 generations of people who called her family: biological descendants, chosen family members, and community members whose lives had been enriched by her example and advocacy. Her last words were characteristically focused on others rather than herself. Remember that love is always worth the risk of losing it. Grace's memorial service filled a Manhattan cathedral, with speakers representing every aspect of her remarkable life. Emily delivered a eulogy that captured her essence. Grace taught us that motherhood isn't about biological connections. It's about showing up consistently, loving unconditionally, and believing in someone's potential even when they can't see it themselves. Jacob spoke about Grace's advocacy work. She transformed her own painful experiences into healing opportunities for others. Grace understood that personal healing wasn't complete unless it contributed to making the world more loving and just for everyone. Charles, now quite frail but determined to honor Grace properly, delivered the final tribute. Grace saved our family by teaching us that love requires courage, that vulnerability is strength, and that the most precious things in life can only be built through daily choices to remain committed to each other's well-being. She was the heart of our family, and her love will continue growing in all the lives she touched. The Institute established an annual Grace Chen Harrington Award for individuals who exemplified her values of service, advocacy, and family devotion. The first recipient was a domestic worker who had successfully advocated for industry-wide reforms in employment contracts and workers' rights. Emily's final art series, completed shortly after Grace's death, was titled Love Made Visible, and featured portraits of all the ways Grace had expressed love, through cooking, gardening, reading bedtime stories, attending school events, and simply being present during both celebrations and difficulties. The series toured museums nationally, raising funds for the Institute while educating audiences about the invisible labor of love that holds families and communities together. Jacob's engineering work increasingly focused on sustainable technologies that could improve living conditions for working-class families, inspired by Grace's childhood experiences with housing insecurity and her lifelong commitment to practical solutions for social problems. Years after Grace's death, her memoir became a bestseller, resonating with readers who recognized their own struggles in her story of finding belonging and purpose through love that transcended traditional family structures. Book clubs, university courses, and community organizations used her story to explore questions about family formation, workers' rights, and the different ways people could build meaningful lives together. The Harrington family home, now managed by Emily and Jacob as a multi-generational residence, continued hosting the annual garden party in Grace's honor. Each year, the celebration brought together domestic workers, caregivers, advocates, and families who had been touched by the Institute's work or inspired by Grace's example. The rooftop garden, now a small urban farm, provided vegetables for the family and donations to local food banks, a living memorial to Grace's belief that love should be practical and generous rather than just sentimental. Visitors often commented on the garden's abundance, not knowing they were witnessing the literal fruits of one woman's patient commitment to nurturing growth wherever she found the opportunity. On the 10th anniversary of Grace's death, the Institute hosted a symposium about non-traditional family structures, featuring research that had grown from Grace's initial oral history project. The event brought together academics, social workers, policy advocates, and families from around the world who had found innovative ways to build loving, supportive relationships outside conventional models. Emily, now recognized as both a successful artist and family advocate, delivered the keynote address about how personal healing could become social transformation. Grace didn't set out to change the world. She just committed to loving the people in front of her as completely as possible. But that complete love rippled outward, touching more lives than she ever could have imagined. That's the power of choosing love over fear, of staying open-hearted despite disappointment, of believing that everyone deserves to feel valued and seen. The symposium concluded with the unveiling of a statue in Central Park, not of Grace herself, which would have embarrassed her, but of hands cradling seedlings, representing the way love nurtures growth in unexpected places. The plaque read, "In honor of Grace Chen Harrington and all who choose to love without conditions, who build families through commitment rather than just biology, and who understand that the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult soil." As sunset fell over Manhattan that evening, Emily and Jacob walked through the park where Grace had once brought them to feed ducks and play on swings during those first precious months when they were learning to become a family. Now they brought their own children to those same spots, sharing stories about the remarkable woman who had shaped their understanding of what family could be. "Do you think Grace knew?" Emily asked her brother as they sat on a bench overlooking the pond, where they had once scattered breadcrumbs with small hands, guided by Grace's patient instruction. "Do you think she understood how much her love would continue growing even after she was gone?" Jacob smiled, watching his teenage daughter explain to her younger cousins how to feed ducks properly, the same patient instruction Grace had once provided to him. "I think Grace always knew that love multiplies when shared rather than diminishing. She planted seeds in all of us, and now we're planting seeds in others. That's how love works. It just keeps growing." As they walked home through the city streets, passing the brownstone where Grace had first attended family therapy with them, the neighborhood where she had lived during her months of unemployment, and finally approaching the mansion that had become a true home only when Grace made it one, Emily and Jacob carried their children and grandchildren the stories that would keep Grace's love alive for generations yet to come. Because that ultimately was Grace's greatest gift, not just the love she had given to one family, but the understanding that love, when offered freely and received with gratitude, becomes a legacy that transcends individual lives and continues growing in ways no one can predict or control. The ceramic horse Emily had made for Grace as a child, now carefully preserved in the family archives, still bore the child's fingerprints in the clay, physical evidence of love freely given and gratefully received. But the real evidence lived in the adults Emily and Jacob had become, the children they were raising, the community they continued serving, and the countless lives touched by the Institute that bore Grace's name. Grace had begun as an invisible domestic worker, dismissed and humiliated by people who couldn't recognize the value of her love. She had ended as a celebrated advocate, beloved family matriarch, and symbol of the power that comes from choosing vulnerability over safety, commitment over convenience, and love over fear, even when that choice initially brings pain. Her story reminded everyone who heard it that the most important work in any society is the work of love, caring for children, supporting families, building communities where everyone can feel valued and seen. That work often goes unrecognized and undercompensated, performed by people whose names never appear in history books, but whose influence shapes the world in ways both profound and permanent. And you, have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you? Have you loved without recognition, served without acknowledgement, given your heart to people who couldn't see its true value? Tell me your story in the comments, because every story of love matters. Every act of caring contributes to the world's healing. And every person who chooses to remain open-hearted despite disappointment carries forward grace's legacy of transforming pain into wisdom and isolation into belonging. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who deserves to feel seen, valued, and honored for the love she gives daily without asking for anything in return, except the chance to keep loving. For more stories about the power of quiet strength and invisible courage, click the link on the left to discover our podcast series celebrating the unsung heroes who hold our world together through love, patience, and unwavering commitment to others' well-being. Thank you for walking this path of the heart with us, for understanding that family is built through choice and commitment rather than just biology, and for believing that love, real, patient, selfless love, always finds a way to transform both the giver and receiver in ways that echo through generations. We'll meet again in our next story, carrying forward the truth that Grace knew and lived. Love multiplies when shared, never diminishes, and the most beautiful things in life grow from hearts willing to remain open despite the risk of breaking.